So students, today we are going to quickly look at the second chapter of Tagore's My Reminiscences. This chapter is called Teaching Begins, and like I mentioned to you previously, for these chapter we are only quickly going to glance off, and I'm going to once again read some excerpts from the text, that is some quotations from the text, and we'll only do an analysis when they say something deeply condensed. Most of the time Tagore is not saying something very complicated. Some of the time he is. It is only sometimes that it will require breaking his passages down, right? So we'll just start with the first quotation that I have selected from chapter 2. So in Teaching Begins, he starts off talking about his early life and his infancy, and then he also mentions how he started his education, that is how his learning started at home. And in that context we are going to look at the first quotation, which goes as follows. We three boys were being brought up together. Both my companions were 2 years older than I. When they were placed under their tutor, my teaching also began, but of what I learned, nothing remains in my memory, right? So this is one of his early memories. And remember that Tagore was not the only child. In fact, if I am not wrong, he was one of 7 children, right? And please check on this, because I may not be saying the exact correct number, but as far as I can recall, I think he was one of 7. In fact, he was the youngest of 7 children. All right. So the sixth child in the household, that is the brother who was born before him, was, I think, 2 years older, which he mentions here. And when he refers to both my companions, I think he's referring to one of his brothers and one of his cousins or something like that, right? So basically he is talking about his extended family, and he says that even though he was 2 years younger to these 2 boys, his education began with them, right? So when they were placed under their tutor, his education began too. But then he also tells us that he learned nothing. In fact, he learned nothing that remains in his memory, to be a little more specific. All right. So not much to break down there, except that it is an important instance from his early life. So moving on, let's now look at the second excerpt. And if you look at the title of this slide, I mentioned that this is Tagore's earliest memory of love for poetry, right? And this is why this is a significant memory, a significant instance, which is why I have selected this excerpt. And I think while you read this and when you revise this text for your exams, this is one of the memories you need to keep in your mind, and if necessary, write your answers where you may refer to this instance. All right. So the quote goes as follows. What constantly recurs to me is the rain patters, the leaf quivers. So this is an instance of him recalling the earliest memory of being attracted to poetry, right? He says, I am just come to anchor after crossing the stormy region of the Kala series, and I am reading The Rain Patters, the Leaf Quivers. For me, the first poem of the arch poet. Whenever the joy of that day comes back to me, even now, I realize why rhyme is so needful in poetry. So here you have an instance of Tagore recognizing the need for rhyme. Because of it, the words come to an end and yet end not. You see the importance he gives on rhyming, the necessity for rhyming that he realizes very early on. So he says, whenever the joy of that day comes back to me, even now, I realize why rhyme is so needful in poetry. Because of it, that is because of rhyme, the words come to an end and yet end not. The utterance is over, but not its ring. And the ear and the mind can go on and on with their game of tossing the rhyme to each other. Okay, so I will just take a brief detour and then come back to Tagore. So in this detour, we are going to talk about Wordsworth for a moment. So I'm sure most of you have read the poem "The Solitary Reaper," right? At least if you haven't read it, you're probably familiar with you. If not, please have a look at this poem, "The Solitary Reaper." It's a very brief poem, and the reason why I bring this poem to the class, why am I trying to bring it to your attention, is the last two lines of the poem. In the last two lines of The Solitary Reaper, Wordsworth says, "The music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more." Right? So I'm not this. I'm just saying off the top of my head. I've not made a slide about it. But try and focus on these two lines, this couplet first, and then we'll go back to Rabindranath Tagore and see how this is relevant, how these two lines of Wordsworth are relevant to our discussion of Tagore in the context of his earliest memory of love for poetry. So, in the poem "The Solitary Reaper," Wordsworth, as in many of his poems, he's just roaming around the countryside, and he comes across this woman who is singing and reaping by herself, right? She is in a field, she's reaping the harvest, and she's singing while at it, right? And so Wordsworth stops there. He does not disturb this woman, right? He just watches her reap the harvest, and he listens to her sing, and then after a few moments, he leaves that place. And uh, he writes this poem much later, right? He doesn't just go home and start writing the poem, right? According to Wordsworth, poetry is the spontaneous recollection of emotions and tranquility, right? I may not be quoting him exactly, but what he says is to that effect, right? Now, what does he say in the last two lines? He says, "The music in my heart I bore." This is the music of the solitary reaper he's referring to. That is, while the solitary reaper was reaping the harvest, she was also singing, and that music, the sound of the song, right? The melody of that song, the tune, it remained with Wordsworth long after it was heard no more, right? So once again, look at the line: "The music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more," right? So long after he had left the place, long after he could not hear the music anymore, the music remained in his heart, right? Something very similar is happening here to Tagore, and which is why I brought this instance from Wordsworth's life and Wordsworth's corpus of poetry to your attention. So what is happening with Tagore in his life? So he says his earliest memory of poems or poetry is this line: "The rain patters, the leaf quivers." So those of you who know this in Bengali, the original was "Jol pore pata nore," right? I'm just mentioning this in case you want to refer to it or in case you just want to know. So just so you know, maybe it is a helpful thing to know, I guess. Useful thing at least to know. "Jol pore pata nore." That is what has been translated in your edition to "the rain patters, the leaf quivers." Now I believe in the English translation a lot is lost, right? But nevertheless, this gives us an instance of Tagore's earliest acquaintance with rhyme and rhythm, at which he becomes a master. Tagore certainly is very easily one of the greatest poets ever in the world, right? He has been called the world poet, and he is the first Nobel laureate outside of Europe, right? Outside of the West, first Asian, and basically first non-white Nobel laureate. And I do not recall if any other Indian author won the Nobel Prize in literature. Now, I'm not saying Nobel Prize. If you win the Nobel Prize, you have conquered the world. I'm not saying anything like that. The point I'm trying to make is that since he won the Nobel Prize, and since he is so well known across the world, definitely all around India, he stands out, right, as a poet. Obviously, he stands out as a lot of things. He stands out as a novelist. He stands out as a songwriter. He even stands out as a painter. So we are not going into all of his qualities. He was certainly a polymath, and irrespective of whether we look at that or not, it's not really relevant to the lecture today. What is relevant to the lecture today is his earliest acquaintance with rhyme and rhythm, right? And he says that whenever the joy of that day, and that day meaning the day when he first was acquainted with this rhyme, this rhythm, jol pore pata nore, or the rain patters, the leaf quivers, right? So whenever the joy of that day comes back to me, to Tagore, even now I realize why rhyme is so needful in poetry, right? So look here, Tagore is not just talking about his life, he's also talking about, he's also giving us a kind of theory of poetry. He's telling us of the importance of rhyme, right? He says that because of rhyme, because of rhythm, the words come to an end. Remember Wordsworth here? The music coming to an end and the music still remaining in his heart despite coming to an end. So because of rhyme and rhythm, words come to an end and yet end not. The utterance is over. The utterance itself may be over. The last word of the poem may have been read 5 minutes ago, maybe 5 years ago, maybe several decades ago, but not its ring. Very similar to what happens to Wordsworth. The music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. And Tagore says, because of rhyme and rhythm, words come to an end and yet end not. The utterance is over, but not its ring. And the ear and the mind can go on and on with their game of tossing the rhyme to each other, right? I hope I have made my point, and I hope you are able to see the importance of rhyme not just in Tagore's life, but more generally in poetry as well. So when you write a critical analysis, for example, you know better than ever, probably, I'm hoping better than ever, how to criticize the presence of rhyme and rhythm. You can quote Tagore, you can thereby elevate any poem's status due to its rhyme and rhythm. Okay, let's move on to the next quote, right? And here Tagore, as you will see, criticizes the schooling system. Here he says, what I learned in school, in the text he says there, and I just changed it to in school for ease of teaching in this case. So what I learned in school, I have no idea. But one of its methods of punishment I still bear in mind. The boy who was unable to repeat his lessons was made to stand on a bench with arms extended, and on his upturned palms were piled a number of slates. It is for psychologists to debate how far this method is likely to conduce to a better grasp of things. So I don't think there is much explanation required here, right? The point here is that Tagore has gone to school and he has had a few unpleasant experiences, and one of his memories that he thinks is notable enough to be quoted in his, or to be mentioned in his autobiography, is this early experience in school, and the fact that schools often tend to give strange punishments which literally have nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with pedagogy or with improvement of how a student studies. So here he refers to an instance where, remember that first he says that he remembers nothing as to what he learned in school, right? So what he learned there, he has absolutely no memory of, right? Because I don't know, probably he learned nothing, I don't know, because we all have our opinions about school, and Tagore clearly has his own here. So he says that even though I remember nothing about what I was taught there, I do remember the kind of punishment they gave us. And he says that whenever a student could not answer questions in class, whenever he was unable to repeat his lessons, right? And remember, there is emphasis on inability to repeat his lessons, because it was just mugging up that was encouraged. So this process of teaching, or this process of learning, is called rote learning, right? Rote learning basically means memorizing, right? And memorizing is one of the ways which is even today largely encouraged in most schools, right? So the education system, it seems, is largely of an opinion, and many teachers, sadly, many teachers still tend to follow this pedagogical structure where they believe that if a student can repeat the lesson that he has been taught or she has been taught, then he has learned. And this idea is completely false, right? I'm sure you all know how bad this is, right? The idea that if I can repeat my lessons, if I can learn something by heart, if I can memorize something, or the technical term for this, as I mentioned, is rote learning. If I can rote learn something, I am a good student. That idea is completely false, right? That leads to nowhere. And Tagore is very critical of this. He says that whenever a student was unable to repeat his lessons, so whenever a student failed to memorize, whenever a student was not successful at rote learning and repeating what the teacher was saying, right, he was given a very strange punishment. And this punishment was that he was made to stand up on the bench with arms extended upwards, and he was made to fold his palm, and on his upturned palms or folded palms, several slates were placed, right? Slates meaning the slates in which students write, right? This is the kind of, this was the substitute or the early equivalent of what today is notebooks. Remember, notebooks began to be mass produced much later. So when Tagore was in school, notebooks were not really common at that time. And slates was what was mostly used in schools, right? And Tagore, the commentary that we get from Tagore is the last line in this quote. It is for psychologists to debate how far this method is likely to conduce to a better grasp of things. Now, the tone of Tagore is very evident here. He is simply critical of it. He does not have doubt in his mind that this method of punishing students is not likely to conduce a better grasp of understanding, a better grasp of the lessons that a student has to learn, right? So hopefully you are able to see that this is a very critical passage from chapter 2, and particularly relevant because here you get to know Tagore's views on the schooling system and Tagore's views on punishments, which today we certainly know are not of any use. Those are just, I'll just refer to one music video. It's a very well-known music video, and maybe some of you will be aware of it. I hope some of you are aware of it. So some of you must have heard the name of Pink Floyd, which is a band, which is a British rock music band, progressive music band from the late 1960s, and they were active even in the 1990s, so they were active for quite long. And so this band has an album called The Wall, and in that album they have a very famous song, Another Brick in the Wall, right? Now that song comes in 3 parts, part 1, part 2 and part 3, obviously. I would ask you all, I would recommend that all of you listen to this song, Another Brick in the Wall part 2, which is a critique of the education system, right? A critique of the schooling system. And this was made in the early 1970s or late 1970s, perhaps late 1970s is the correct date, but never quote me on these dates. The point is, it is a critique of the education system, which Tagore is also critical of. So, and it's certainly a great song. It's one of the greatest rock songs written ever, right? So listen to that song, and I'm sure you will be able to find relevance. You will also be able to find an equivalence of what Tagore is saying here. It's also critical of the way students are punished, and it even goes further. This song even goes further, commenting on what happens to students as a result of such a foolish education system, which emphasizes on rote learning rather than proper education, where students are actually conduce a good grasp of what they are taught, right? So finally, one more quotation from chapter 2, and we'll end here. Here he says, I was playing about in the long veranda overlooking the road. All of a sudden, Satya, for some reason I do not remember, wanted to frighten me by shouting. Satya is one of the members of his extended family, close to his age. Shouting what? Policemen, policemen. My ideas of the duties of policemen were of an extremely vague description, so he did not really know what the policeman's job was. One thing I was certain about, that a person charged with crime, once placed in a policeman's hands, would, as sure as the wretch caught in a crocodile's serrated grip, go under, and be seen no more. So Tagore says, I was not really sure what a policeman does, but I was certain that policemen were very similar to crocodiles. In what sense? If someone is caught in a crocodile's grip, he will go under and will never be seen again. His idea of policemen was also similar, that if someone is once caught by a policeman, that person is gone for life, vanished for a lifetime, has taken a trip to Belize, right? So, not knowing how an innocent boy could escape this relentless penal code, I bolted towards the inner apartments with shudders running down my back for blind fear of pursuing policemen. I broke to my mother the news of my impending doom, but it did not seem to disturb her much, obviously. However, not deeming it safe to venture out again, I sat down on the sill of my mother's door and read the dog-eared Ramayana with a marbled paper cover which belonged to her old aunt. So the importance of this instance from his early life is his early fear of the penal system, one might say. Also, his fear of things that he did not know well enough, right? As he says, my ideas of duties of policemen were of a vague description. You know what? Go back to our lessons of nationalism and try and remember what Tagore says about xenophobia. He says there that xenophobia is a fear of strangers, right? It is a fear of other cultures. It is a fear of other languages, right? It is a fear of behaviors that you do not practice at home but other people do. And where does this fear stem from? It stems from lack of knowledge. And as that's exactly what happens here. My ideas of the duties of policemen were of an extremely vague description. So when you don't know something well enough, when you don't know other people well enough, when you don't know other cultures well enough, you are more likely to be afraid of them. And that, as Tagore pointed out in his essays on nationalism, is something that promotes xenophobia. It promotes something like nationalism, an ideology like nationalism, right? So as you can see, even from his early memories, you can draw lessons which are relevant to Tagore's later works, right? More mature works. So this is where we end chapter 2. In the subsequent classes, I will follow a similar exercise. I will quote, that is, I will draw upon excerpts from the text, the ones that I deem are important, and I'm going to talk about them, break them down for you whenever necessary.